Good morning. As a licensed mental health counselor, it is so good to be here. Usually, whenever I go to mental health conferences across the country, they tend to be in convenient airport locations with free continental breakfasts. So we get kind of fake eggs and boxed cereals. So it is very good to be upgraded to a CEO conference. So as you know, my first name is Jay. What many of you likely didn't know is that my middle name is Elmer. Some chuckles. This was middle school for me. So I have both my grandfather's names. Jay was my dad's father's name, and Elmer was my mom's father's name. Jay died 2 years before I was born, and Elmer died when I was in graduate school. And I'm not sure if you've ever been in a funeral for a family member, but the sadness that I felt in that scene was not so much that my grandfather Elmer had died, but the reality that I never really knew him in his life. We knew the stories about how he was a Pearl Harbor survivor. We knew that he was one of the first missionaries allowed into Albania, but I knew nothing about his personal life. And so a couple years later, my grandmother, my dad's mom, Dorothy, was beginning to decline in her health and was going to come out to the Seattle area to be closer to my parents. And I quickly realized that if I want to know anything significant about the life of a living grandparent, now was going to be the time to do it. The only complexity, however, was that Dorothy could be a cold steel door of emotion. If you don't believe me, I can remember being 8 years old. It's mid-January, and she calls my house. My parents are out on a date. And I say, "Grandma, can I take a message?" And she says, "No, that's okay. Actually, maybe just tell your father that I was very disappointed by what your family gave me for Christmas this past year." Okay, I'll send that message right along. So Grandma, we called her Nanny, moved out to Seattle. And she was about to turn 90 years old. And I said, this is my opportunity. So I went to an antique store in Seattle, Washington, and I bought her 3 skeleton keys. So I got this really beautiful box, took her out to a cafe, and I gave her this box, and she opened it. And I said, "Grandma, these 3 keys symbolize 3 lunches that I want to take you out to learn more about your life." I thought it was the best grandson gift of all time. She looked completely horrified. It was like I had just asked for my inheritance. 5 seconds passed, 10 seconds passed, and Dorothy said nothing. Eventually, she looked down at the beautiful box, looked back up at me, and then pushed the box back across the table at me and said something that changed my life. "Jay, there are some doors you just don't open. There are some stories you just don't tell." A couple minutes later, my grandmother said, "Can you take me back to my assisted living home?" And that would be our last meaningful conversation. So a couple years later, after Dorothy died, my parents were going through her medical records and found some pretty shocking information. My dad had always grown up believing that he was the firstborn child to Dorothy, but in his medical records, there was one of those boxes that was asked if Dorothy had had any previous births, and that box was checked yes. So as best as we have been able to put together, Dorothy was likely raped by some family member around the age of 13 or 14 years old and then shipped off to Louisiana. You see, my grandmother's cold locked door of emotion wasn't random. It was a direct reflection of the parts of her story, her trauma, and her abuse that she had no context to talk about. I've often wondered a lot since that day how my life and my father's life and my family's life would have been different had my grandmother had a context to share that devastating story. My grandmother is who poet Maya Angelou refers to when she says, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." This morning, I want to talk to each of you about the stories that you don't want to tell. The simple assumption is that each of us have stories that we wish we could efface from our lives. That could be an unwanted sexual behavior like a lifelong struggle with porn, maybe an affair that you had during a low point in your marriage, but it could also be a story from long ago one that you have concluded is just too unspeakable to name. And you know that you're getting really close to those stories when the severe voice of shame warns you, and I mean it warns you, to remain silent. What I want to propose, however, is this counterintuitive, if not radical, notion that your untold stories, like my grandmother's, actually contain the keys to the freedom that you have been waiting your entire life to find. And so therefore, one of the greatest gifts that you could give yourself this morning is to suspend the belief that you know what your untold stories reveal about you, or that revealing them would lead to your ultimate demise in the eyes of others. Shame is a merciless storyteller. So in my work as a psychotherapist, I work with unwanted sexual behavior, which I just define as basically any sexual behavior that someone is participating in that at the end of the day, they wish was not true. So this could be the use of porn, infidelity, hookups, buying sex, essentially anything that's beginning to bring ruin to someone's life. And what we know from the statistics is that unwanted sexual behavior is really everywhere that we look. I want you to look at these statistics. A third of all marriages in this room will be impacted by infidelity. Approximately 30% of pornography users are now women. Porn sites receive more monthly traffic than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. And 57% of our pastors and 64% of our youth pastors are struggling or have struggled with porn. Additionally, in 1 year, last year, the world watched 4.6 billion hours of pornography on one website alone. That's equal to over 5,000 centuries. There are some theorists that are even beginning to say that pornography use across the world is one of the best metrics of cultural attention that we have. So if you want to know what anybody is doing at any given point in time, all you need to do is look at porn rates across the country. One example of this was in the 2017 NBA Finals. Does anyone know who was participating in that one? Cleveland Cavaliers and who else? And the Warriors. So it's Game 5, and Cleveland is down, and so Game 5 begins, and porn use goes down about -6% in the Cleveland area. But then at some point during the third quarter, it becomes really apparent that Cleveland is going to lose Game 5, and therefore the NBA Finals, and porn use goes up 34% in Cleveland. Additional data point is that when Instagram and Facebook stopped working, earlier this year, porn use went up 19% across the country. So while unwanted sexual behavior has become dangerously ubiquitous, the primary Christian approach to addressing it has been what I refer to as lust management. And you know this all too well. This is the bounce your eyes when you're having a sexual thought, basically slap a rubber band around your wrist if you can't help lusting, take a cold shower, and then if you continue to struggle, you definitely need some internet monitoring and accountability. But as one of my friends recently said to me, he said, Jay, when I have been having the same conversation with my accountability partner for 15 years, something isn't working. And so I realized that unless we radically change this conversation, we are going to continue to consign men and women and marriages to a lifetime of futility with this issue. And something just kind of rose up within me that said literally, hell no, not on my watch. And so what I wanted to do was to actually just ask people who were struggling with unwanted sexual behaviors to tell me their story, not just about their sexual brokenness. We spend millions of dollars on research just to get stats to reinforce the reality that porn is a problem in our churches, it's a problem in our world. So I wanted to ask people who were struggling to tell me their story, because I figured if we could get insights from that data, then we could return it back to them to aid their freedom. And that is exactly what happened in the research that I did for my book, Unwanted: How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Way to Healing. And so what I can tell you from the outset is that there is nothing random about your unwanted sexual behaviors, even the specific search for terms that you put into the internet and the fantasies that you have about infidelity. they could always be shaped and predicted based on the parts of your story that remained unaddressed. And I think the implication of this is huge. It means that your sexual brokenness, or the sexual brokenness of someone that you love, can actually be a roadmap to healing, not a life sentence to sexual shame and addiction. Let me show you how. So when I moved to the Seattle area to begin my grad work, I lived with a housemate who worked the closing shift at our local Starbucks. And if you know anything about that shift, you tend to have one privilege kind of bequeathed to you, and that's free day-old pastries. And so a couple days a week, my friend Dave would walk in with these 2 big Starbucks bags full of baked goods. And as he began to unload it, basically this like stadium of blueberry and pumpkin scones, chocolate and molasses cookies, cake pops, and to me, the most alluring of all, the apple fritter. And so on evenings that I would get home late after, a very hard day in seminary, and I'm not sure if you've ever had these experiences, but I could almost hear these baked goods whisper to me. And they would say, "Jay, put me in the microwave for 16 seconds. And I obeyed. And then I would drizzle white chocolate sauce all over the sizzling dough, and I would have myself an evening. The next morning, unsurprisingly, I would despise myself. I would look down, see my weight that I had been gaining, and then basically hide out in a coffee shop after class because I feared that people would see my face and therefore an appetite that I had learned to condemn. And then I would get home the next night, and here's the madness of all of our unwanted behaviors. I would begin to pursue the same exact thing that had just brought me shame the entire day. But this time, after eating another apple fritter with chocolate and white chocolate sauce, I would begin to feel even more miserable, even more shame. And I needed something to take that away. And this quickly became the role of pornography in my life. The more misery that I felt, the more pornography that I pursued. And unfortunately for me, this basically carbohydrate ritual of consumption and shame had been going on at that point for over a decade. If my eating habits were a Netflix episode, there would be a flashback to this boy. I was an 8th grader, and I was the child of a pastor, and my nickname in middle school was Donut. I was, as my bus stop peers used to say, even too fat to play football. And so what made middle school even worse for me than having a nickname of Donut and a middle name of Elmer was that I grew up in the era of the Pillsbury Doughboy commercials. And so, a couple mornings a week, my bus stop peers would come up and they would take their finger and push it into my belly with the signature Doughboy giggle. Yoo-hoo! And then what would happen in the evening is I would get home, I would feel so much shame, so much self-hatred, and then I would go and eat more sweet dough, more brownies, more ice cream, and then I would look at my belly in the mirror, and I would hate myself, and I would grab it and shake it like a doormat. And you know where this story goes from here. Where does a middle schooler who hates himself go to find relief and yet simultaneously reinforce his sense of shame? Sexual brokenness. The stories of humiliation and shame that I couldn't tell from middle school eventually grew into a life story that I was too ashamed to tell. And the more that we feel ashamed, the more that we pursue behaviors that provide us with irrefutable evidence that we are broken beyond repair. Contrary to popular wisdom, we are not looking for love in all the wrong places. We're not primarily self-medicating or finding an escape. We are pursuing behaviors that confirm how cursed or stuck or unwanted we believe we are. But just as my unwanted behaviors were trying to get my attention and invite me to find healing for this boy, so is your sexual brokenness a clarion call to heal the underlying heartaches of your story. We will not know the fullness of the healing that God has for us if we merely try to quarantine, fight, and bounce our eyes from our unwanted behaviors. If you want to be a healthy leader, you have to enter the holes in your story. These are the themes where you trust God, but mostly do not. The most difficult part of my journey out of unwanted sexual behavior has not been to outgrow pornography. Can we show the picture again? It's to turn and face this boy with kindness, to not wince. You'll notice that this is not a very good photo. One of the reasons for that is I tried to trash almost every photo of this kid that I could find when I got to high school. I wanted to erase him. And so one of the deepest places of healing that I have had to understand is Romans 2:4. Do you not know that it is the kindness of God that leads to change? We need kindness for our stories, for our behaviors, if we are going to experience freedom. So how does all this relate to your lives as CEOs? I've got some thoughts. What I have learned about my work with executives over the last decade is that you all are some of the most profoundly gifted and yet astoundingly lonely men and women that I have ever met. As one of my clients put it, a CEO is like an elephant, and everyone wants your tusks. The amount of complexity, transference, salary, and isolation that you all have quickly makes your life a petri dish for unwanted behaviors of all kinds. With the demands of your life, being a healthy leader probably sounds a little bit like an oxymoron. And in case there was any doubt about how difficult your jobs were, I want to provide you with some additional statistics. Here's what we know about CEOs. 50 to 60% of executives fail within the first 18 months of their position. And then secondly, in Ron Carucci and Eric Hansen's survey for their book, Rising to Power, The Journey of Exceptional Executives, highly recommend it, they found that 38% of executives did not expect the loneliness and the isolation of their jobs. As you all know, you distinguish yourself through individualism, but then you profoundly underestimate how much you need people when you get to the top. In the same survey, Carucci and Hansen found that 61% of executives did not feel prepared for the strategic challenges that they faced upon being appointed to executive positions. I obviously don't know the particulars of your story, but what I can imagine is that paralysis and loneliness are often very consistent friends. And if you haven't said it yet, like the psalmist in Psalm 88, you're likely going to cry at some point, "Darkness is a closer friend than you, O God." And to compound this even further, what my research showed about the average person struggling with unwanted sexual behaviors was that 59% of people struggling with unwanted sexual behavior did not feel like they had anyone to talk to when they were struggling. Only 20% of respondents in my survey of over 4,000 people actually pursued someone when they were struggling. As Brené Brown says, shame needs three things to grow: silence, secrecy, and judgment. And what we know in the clinical field is that the more that you feel shame, the more unwanted behaviors you are going to pursue. So what are we supposed to do with all of this data and all of these realities of what stresses and difficulties are on your life? To that, I want to turn to a thought by screenwriting coach extraordinaire and CEO consultant Robert McKee. And this is what he says in his work with executives and companies. He says, "When people ask me to turn their presentations into stories, I begin by asking questions. I kind of psychoanalyze their companies, and amazing dramas pour out. But most companies and executives sweep the dirty laundry, the difficulties and the antagonists and the struggle under the carpet. They prefer to present a rosy and boring picture to the world. But as the storyteller, you want to position the problems in the foreground and then show how you overcome them. So if this is true for your business, how much more true is this for your personal life? If you want to grow, you have to bring your problems, your shame into the foreground and then work to overcome them. And I want to tell you two brief stories of two CEOs who have done just that. The first man's name is Jonathan. And Jonathan arrived in my office after an international business trip. And he did something that he swore that he would never do in his entire life. He accepted the invitation to have a massage that he knew would end in an orgasm. And in my first session with Jonathan, I learned that his marriage, like many in this room, had become increasingly sexless. There was a point where he was in his home office and his wife caught him watching pornography. And basically what she told him is, until you get this sick thing figured out, we're not having sex again. And 5 years later, a new CEO position, getting their kids off to school, they never found the time or the desire to return back to that conversation. But their life went on as it normally did. They went to movies, they attended fundraisers, they even had family reunions where they talked about the family legacy. But him and his wife were growing continents apart. And on his business trip to Hong Kong, a client offered to send him up a massage, and he accepted. In my second session with Jonathan, I learned that he didn't really start using pornography compulsively until his second CEO position. In his first CEO position, he had been a very successful CEO at a Fortune 500 company, and everyone believed that his past accomplishments would easily translate into future success. And you all in this room know better than most, that's not always the case. And so as his challenges and failures grew, his sense of isolation deepened. And the more that he felt stuck, the more that he felt depressed, the more that he felt like he couldn't get his life back on track, the more he started using pornography. So when clients like Jonathan ask me to tell, when they ask me, or when they tell me about some of their sexual brokenness, one of the questions that I tend to ask them is to share some of the specifics of what they search for on the internet. And judging by his face, he looked horrified again, and I'd imagine this is probably the reason why many of you have avoided therapy. And he said, I've never thought about it, but why is that even important? And what I told him is that each of us have a sexual template, basically an arousal template that we find highly erotic. So that could be images, thoughts, sensations, times of day. And what my research showed is that every one of those messages has something really important to teach us if we are willing to pay attention. And so for Jonathan, his arousal template was, in his words, basically anyone who had amazing eyes. He said that there were nights where he would look at pornography and just scroll through for hours trying to get that right look from someone in the porn film. Most commonly, this ended up being some type of older figure, a mother figure, someone in the film who had more authority over the man in the film. And then he also said that he would drive around in his car in the Bay Area and try and lock eyes with someone on the streets. And what my data showed about men like Jonathan who sought out these fantasies of a mother figure, someone who had power, or a body type that was larger, is they tended to have this in their stories. They had an emotionally confiding parent, they had a history of past sexual abuse, and they had current depression. Or let's say that you are a man who tends to look at pornography dealing with college students, someone that was younger, maybe a body type that appeared to you as someone that was more subservient. This tended to be your story. You had a strict father, a lack of purpose, and high levels of shame. As you can see, the writing on the wall is that men often flee to the world of unwanted sexual behavior because it gives them an arena to reestablish power and be served in the midst of the difficulties that they were facing in life. As Father Richard Rohr says, the pain that we do not transform, we transmit. Always someone else has to suffer because I don't know how to suffer. That is what it comes down to. So the fascinating thing about my research is that almost all of our fantasies could be predicted, and the struggles that we had actually had a lot to communicate with us. So I want to show you just to scratch some of the surface of the findings. The most significant pornography users had sexual abuse scores that were nearly 24% higher than those who did not view pornography at all. So if your first sexual template is abusive, you have shame, you have oxytocin, bonding. Basically, what you are going to recreate later in life are basically the same neurochemicals of your abuse, where you feel shame, you feel pleasure, and you feel secrecy. And additionally, without a clear sense of purpose in our lives, unwanted sexual behavior increased by a factor of 7. So if you don't know who you are in life, if you don't know where you're going, pornography is going to quickly become a squatter in your life. So in therapy, I began to work with Jonathan on this concept of what does it mean to listen to his lust, to study it. And to do that, what I will often do is to ask my clients 2 key questions. The first is to tell me about basically their first exposure to pornography or one of their first sexual experiences. And the reason why I do that is that so many of us have falsely concluded that we just merely discovered pornography. But all I can tell you is that if you happen to find your grandparents' porn stash or your father's porn stash or your brother's porn stash under a bed or in a closet or in a garage, all I can tell you is that someone put it there with a near 100% chance that any child with an ounce of curiosity is going to find it. And additionally, many people dismiss their first sexual experiences as simply just something that was awkward or weird. We have to step into what was actually unfolding. And the second question that I ask is for my clients to tell me about a significant trauma that occurred in their life, usually between the ages of 5 to 15. And the reason that I do that is because, as we have now learned, trauma is not just an event that happened to us long ago, it's the current imprint on that trauma on us today. So for Jonathan, his first sexual experience was actually with his babysitter. His parents had gone off to an anniversary weekend and hired a family friend that was kind of in a gap year between high school and college. And so the first night that she put Jonathan down, she sang him a song, she massaged his back, and he fell right to sleep. But then on the second night, in a very flirtatious way, she said, "Jonathan, do you want to return the favor?" And she took off her shirt and invited him to massage her back and her chest. As he would later reflect, he said, "It never felt like sexual abuse at the time. It felt like I was experiencing touch and song for one of the first times in my life." And what I would later remark to him is that the tenderness of that scene seemed to be a spring, even if a toxic one, in the midst of a desert in his life. And what he said is, "I think that that's really true." And what he went on to tell me about was that his first memory in life was being about 2 or 3 years old. He wakes up in the middle of the night, he's crying, and he's reaching his little arms through the crib, and no one came. The second memory that he had a recall of was being about 6 years old. He has the flu, and he watches his dad go out of the driveway to head to work, and then he watches his mom go out of the driveway to go off to an aerobics class. And he's sitting there at the window, crying with his hand on the window, sitting next to a nanny crying, always hoping that his mom or dad might turn around. And then the next story that Jonathan told was basically being 7th grade, and his parents gave him this amazing new bike. It was a Schwinn. And he said, Jay, I loved that bike. I used to ride around my neighborhood for hours, just hoping to lock eyes with someone in my middle school class or a mom on the street. And what he would later remark is that the best time to do that was late spring through early fall. And he said the reason for that is most people tended to have barbecues, they were out on their lawns, and he would often get an invite to come over for dinner. When we are in the ruts of our sexual brokenness, the story that is always at the forefront of our minds is our sexual shame and our failure. But in many ways, our sexual brokenness is the most honest dimension of our life because it reveals the stories about where we have been and where we are right now. Healing is about seeing our sexual brokenness with new eyes as to what the story is trying to reveal. So in telling his story and studying his fantasy life, here's what Jonathan discovered. He was undone between the connection between riding his bicycle around, hoping to lock eyes with someone in his class or a friend's mom, in the way that he eventually channeled that into looking at pornography and trying to lock eyes with other women on the streets. Jonathan also began to see that the disconnection and the emotional barrenness of his childhood was now what his marriage was experiencing. Sexual massages with those outside of his family offered him connection, but also high levels of shame. The themes of his sexual story were a confluence of emptiness, exploitation, and shame, and that became his sexual cocktail that he was unconsciously trying to remix anytime he felt depression. As you can see, attempting to address Jonathan's unwanted behaviors with accountability, lust management, and yes, even the encouragement to be a godly man would never be effective. Why? Because the underlying stories that drove his pornography use and unwanted behaviors were completely overlooked. We simply cannot find health when there are so many stories in our lives devoid of care. The second person I want to tell you about is a woman named Lauren. Lauren arrived in my office after an emotional affair nearly escalated to a full-blown affair when she was out of town on a business trip. She is the CEO of a local Seattle startup, and she began texting another CEO that she had met at a conference in Austin. What she didn't realize at the time was that she had left her iPad at her house in Seattle. And so she begins texting with this other CEO. They begin to be increasingly flirtatious. And meanwhile, her husband back in Seattle opens up the iPad and then just starts watching all of these messages come in. So he's trying to figure out what's happening, and then he sees that there's some guy that invites his wife, Lauren, to a hotel room in room 612 in Austin. So Lauren's wife panics, Lauren's husband panics, and he calls her about 5 times before she eventually picks up, and he just starts screaming at her, and he says, if you're not on the next flight home to Seattle, we are getting a divorce. And in my first few sessions with Lauren, I learned that her career had been a major source of contention throughout her life. As a Christian, so many men, but especially women, had always tried to tell her that family, her marriage, had far more eternal worth than her career. They never overtly just came out to tell her that her place was in the home, but they sure as well implied it. And then, as her career began to succeed, her husband's envy of her life dramatically increased. And again, he never came out to own his envy. He just kind of talked about how he was never prioritized and how she got all the right opportunities. Lauren felt like she was in a bind. Her husband was often needy. He would play World of Warcraft when he could have been developing himself, and he was often sulking for connection. Lauren secretly wondered, how could I ever find desire for a man who seems to desire nothing in life? So in my session with Lauren, I asked her, what do you believe is actually driving your desire for infidelity? And she quickly responded by saying, my needs are not met. I am so tired of feeling like I'm cheating on my husband just because I love my work. I'm so tired of the closest people in my life seeing me as a competition. I asked her to share more, and I was reminded of some of the research findings about why women are driven towards infidelity. High levels of shame, perceived unmet needs, and childhood sexual abuse. Lauren shared that her mother was a homemaker and always tried to conform Lauren to her image. So Lauren often saw the shadow side of all of her mom's purported virtues. Basically, whenever her mom would not get her way, she would become increasingly unstable and would become really cruel. And so whenever Lauren's mom was having a difficult time, if she was overwhelmed with household duties, if she was upset with her husband, basically what she would do is issue this distress signal, which was basically she would unload the dishwasher and take the plates and kind of just frisbee them up into the cabinet. And then she would take the dishwasher, open it again, take the utensil basket, bring it over to the drawer, and then just rattle it until everything fell out into the drawer. So when things like this would happen, Lauren and her dad, who was also a successful businessman, would just kind of look at each other with those knowing eyes that a father and a daughter have, and then they would head out into his car and head out for ice cream, go shopping, basically anything to get away from Lauren's mom. And so the closer that Lauren became with her dad, the more cruelty that she experienced. And what Lauren told me is, she said, it always felt like I was cheating on my dad. I was always cheating on my mom with my dad. My dad called me his princess, and yet I knew that he enjoyed me so much more than the queen. Lauren and her father were a united nation until she got a boyfriend, and then she began to feel like she was a traitor. Her father used to come into her room, read her journals, and then ask her how far she had been going sexually. The only way that Lauren conceived of an idea to escape these binds in her life was to head out from the East Coast, thousands of miles away, to a university in Seattle. In my work with Lauren, she began to see how inevitable an affair was in her story. Again, what my data found about women who fantasized about older men was that they had high unmet needs, a mother who was very strict, and a father who confided in them. Ever since Lauren was a young girl, people wanted to possess her. And she realized that the only way that she could get out was a new relationship. A new relationship would be her one-way ticket to freedom. And so whenever she felt trapped, she would find respite in the arms of another person. First it was her dad, then it was a boyfriend, then a new city, and then a series of emotional affairs. As long as she had an out, she would never have to confront the grief that her family and her closest relationships were never a place for her to be known and respected. As an adult, Lauren's childhood patterns of outsourcing her freedom to someone else remained operative. Healing wasn't found in recommitting her marriage to faithfulness. She had done that dozens of times. But in allowing her desire for unfaithfulness to be a clarion call to heal the underlying traumas in her story and to build the strength to address the relational binds that her life was in. And so for the first time in Lauren's life, she began to fight for her marriage, not just to recommit to marriage, but to really fight for the things that she so desperately wanted to have, but never believed that she could. So I want to be clear with you that I'm not asking you to draw hard and fast conclusions right now between your unwanted sexual behaviors and your past story. I certainly believe that those connections are there. And if you're interested, I have a book and a lot of resources that will help you understand the compass headings that are driving your unwanted behaviors. But maybe as I talked about my story, Jonathan's story, and Lauren's, certain scenes from your life were coming to mind. And if so, those are the stories that I would want you to be most curious about. My question to each of you is, how many of you could tell me the stories that formed and sustain your sexual brokenness? What I can underscore is that when Jonathan and Lauren arrived in therapy, none of these connections had ever occurred to them, which makes me wonder, which stories in your life have you concluded are irrelevant to your struggle? Or maybe, like my grandmother Dorothy, having vowed will never be heard by anyone. Throughout the book of Genesis, those who find themselves in a difficult place, a broken place, are met by the kindness and the relentless curiosity of God. And I have to believe that it's going to be the same way in our lives. So in Genesis, when Adam has just eaten of the tree that he was commanded not to eat from, God shows up and doesn't say, Adam, bounce your eyes from that next tempting piece of fruit. He asks him questions. What have you done? Where are you? And then to Jacob, who has been struggling his entire life with lying, the angel of the Lord doesn't show up and say, here, I'm going to give you an accountability partner. God wrestles with Jacob and then asks him the question that's been difficult for him to answer his entire life. What is your name? And then to Hagar, the Egyptian servant, go back. And then to Hagar, who is the Egyptian mistress of our patriarch, she goes out into the wilderness where by all accounts she's going to die. And the angel of the Lord finds her in the midst of the barrenness and asks her two of the best questions that any of us could ever be asked in our lives. Where do you come from? And where are you going? The presence of God in our lives calls forth the stories that we don't want to tell, because he knows that in our honest wrestling with our story, we are going to understand just how committed God is to our redemption. And so the next time that you find yourself, your marriage, in a broken story, may you recognize that the God of the universe is not ashamed of you. Instead, his face is turned toward you with kindness, and his arrival is not to reproof you, but to get down on his knees, to lock eyes with you, and to offer his body and his blood precisely in the midst of a story that you can only see through the lens of failure. And it's only here that we begin to see that this God is not inviting us to lock up the doors of desire within us, but instead, inexplicably, he's given us the keys to his entire kingdom. And we are invited to unlock all the beauty that we can find on this earth. My friends, we have no idea the redemption that God has for us within the locked stories of our lives. Thank you.